and welcome to this masterclass. This is the first proper OMC, as I call them, that we're going to do. And as you may know, it is on Scriabin's 12th Étude, Opus 8. It is in D flat minor, so 6 sharps is a bit of a unique key. So I'm going to run you through it all. Let's go through a few basics before we start off the actual in-depth analysis. So I've got a script here I'm sort of going to be following, and I've got a couple of scores on my iPad here, and the one that I use. I've played this piece quite a lot in the past, performed it probably about a dozen times. There is a recording actually of the channel when I played it when I was about 17. It's not a seamless recording, but it's good phrasing, it's good musicality. There are some errors in there, but it was a live performance. There are very little live performances on this piece that I've seen in the past where you don't hear some sort of errors, and it's not surprising. It's a highly complex and difficult piece. I'm also just going to say in advance, I do apologise. It's a combination between sort of muscle memory and sight reading. This piece I'm currently looking at, I last performed it about 6 or 7 months ago. So, yeah. So let's delve into the first thing. The first thing is a thing I always get asked is about scores. I normally go and look at the local music library because I don't have any actual books with Scriabin scores of this piece at the moment at home. I have looked online and I have found 2 scores. Sorry, let me find this one. This is this one, I think, isn't it? Yes, this is a Shirma. So there's a Shirma and then there's a Belaif. I don't know how, I think it's Belaif you pronounce it. He's sort of the person for Scriabin. He has some good scores. He was sort of the main person. There's actually something called the Belaif Circle in sort of the 1890s in sort of late Tsarist Russia with people like Rimsky-Korsakov, Scriabin. He will have known Scriabin and is sort of like the Urtext equivalent, I guess. I think he was the first person to transcribe this this score. I definitely know he did it for a couple of the sonatas, if I'm not mistaken. So this is the score that I have at home and been recommended and learned from when I learned this piece. But there's also a Shirma here, which I think has some really important things on it as well, which I'd like to point out. So I'm going to use the Belaif score, as you can see, it's quite annotated for the main part, and then we'll refer to the Shirma score when applicable. I will look at other scores once I have access to the music library, which obviously I don't at the moment due to COVID-19. Appropriateness is another question I always get asked. I find it a very difficult piece. I have some teachers, some professors who deter their students from playing it, even if they've played for 30 or 40 years. And so it's a very difficult piece. And I know some people some professors of mine who've never even touched it. I've played it because I had big hands. I enjoy it. I find it a very rewarding piece. One of my favourite pieces out there, actually, in this sort of style, this Étude style. I would also recommend that you have big hands. There are passages where you have sort of leaps of tenths, 11ths, which aren't always easy, which you're going to have to play arpeggiated, but just big hands will help you, especially with some spreads as well, which we'll talk about later on. You need to have a good sense of rhythm, differentiating between 8ths and 16ths and that sort of stuff, not easy. And yeah, lots of practice, but I find it very highly rewarding. Pieces for preparation is also something I get asked quite a lot of. I just recommend learning some other Scriabin pieces, stuff like his Études is an Opus 8 set, an Opus 11 set, there's some good ones in there. Maybe some Chopin as well. One that just instantly springs to mind is his Opus 25, number 10, I think, which is the one with the octaves in B minor, which has these big octaves, and then you sort of have the melody in a chord. So I don't know what it is exactly, but that's one of the chords, and you have this B natural in here, which is the octave, which is the sort of melody within, and you have some of that in there. That will become increasingly useful sort of on the 3rd page of this piece. That's just one that springs to mind. For Scriabin, of the set, of the Opus 8 set, it's sort of what the revolutionary Étude is of Chopin in his Opus 10 set. It's sort of an elegy of sorrow, a defiant march, whatever you call it. It's not those literally, but in regards to the significance to the Opus number, the Opus set, it's really the most well known. It's probably the best known Scriabin piece out there. As I said, I wouldn't recommend this piece for beginners, but it is a great piece, and I can't give you, I have to know your individual level to assess, but I wouldn't recommend it, as I said, for beginners. I recommend it for very advanced people with the aforementioned criteria. So I think, referring to the Bidwell score, before going into the in-depth analysis, I'd actually like to look at some of the basics of the piece, and just sort of have a holistic overview of what exactly this piece is, because I think that's quite a sort of good visual sort of way to know the piece. So I think the Bidwell score is practical because it's 3 pages, and I'm not sure if the schema is just because of the format on the iPad. Well, actually, no, this has been scanned in, so this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages, I think, yeah. So the reason I say that is because 3 pages, and I classify the piece in a ternary, so an ABA form. I don't know if it's intentional or not, probably was, because the phrasing is very balanced. It's always 2 times 8 bars in each section of each form. So for me, the A part is essentially the first page. If we look at it with regard to the Bidwell score, we're looking at the statement of the main theme, main rhythmic motifs. For me personally, it's the hardest bit of the whole piece. And you have 2 8-bar phrases repeated with slight variations, but with the same sort of rhythmic motifs and often the same harmonies, but slight differences, which we'll talk about. And the second bit is what I nicknamed the lyrical bit. I just like it because it sounds quite lyrical, it's quite poetic. It's a complete contrast to the to the A section, but you still have the underlying rhythmic motifs in there, which we'll talk about in a minute. These 16th notes followed by quarter notes, which we'll talk about in a minute. Some leaps, in these octaves, which are somewhat similar to what you see on the first page in the A part. Once again, you have 2 times 8 bar, and you have the second 8-bar phrase is a bit different to it all. It's something unique, but it's sort of a build-up to the dramatic second A part, which is obviously different to the first A part, but is based off of that, which a B part isn't really. We see the same form and rhythmic motifs and the same theme, I guess you could call it, reoccur, but with much denser chords and accompaniment around it. And yeah, so I think if you have the first page nailed, I think the rest of the piece shouldn't be too difficult for you. I do apologise for the loud bird over there. It gets very hot in here otherwise. But yeah, so I mean, I think the first page is quite important. And if you nail that, I think the rest of the piece won't be too difficult. But if you don't nail the first piece, I think you're going to struggle with the first page. You're going to struggle with the rest of the piece. With regards to tempo, that's also something that people talk and ask about, because there's a lot of difference. I mean, it says on the scores on both Schirmer and Bidwell, you see here, 100 to 112. I personally play between 90 and 95. I think it's played too quickly. There's a recording of Scriabin out there where he probably plays about 125, 130. He plays it really quickly, as the people at Matsuev. And there are people that play in about 3 minutes. I probably play in about 230, 240. And you have people that sort of break the 2-minute mark, just about, or maybe slightly even below, which I think is a bit too extreme. It comes down to you, but I'd say I personally, as my personal preference, is to play it slightly slower. So yeah, let's delve into in-depth analysis of this piece. So I hope that will be more insightful than sort of this holistic overview, but I hope this holistic overview helped as well. Right, so delving into the first A part, as I call it, i.e. the first page on the Bidwell score, I think what we first need to talk about are the first 8 bars and the main rhythmic motif, which I've sort of already talked about. I think comparing it and analysing it is quite important. So I've written here, compare it between bar 2 and bar 1. So that's 2. Yeah, so I mean, I think there are 2 main sort of motifs within the 8-bar phrase in the start, right? The first one is obviously this authentic phrase, and this is where I really want to consult the Schirmer scoring, because the Bidwell scoring doesn't have any phrasing. And I think it's important to understand the phrasing. So the phrasing I'm talking about in the Schirmer score, and both of these, by the way, you can find them on IMSLP. So do use these. The quarantine won't have an impact on you not finding them. So the Schirmer score argues that all of the right hand in bar 1 and bar 2, bar the last note in bar 2, which is this high 16th C sharp octave, are all part of one phrase. So we're looking at all of that being one phrase. Then we have this rest, and then they argue the second bit would be the dum bum. So not including the 16th note, just including the Yeah. So that's what they argue. I would probably argue along those lines. With that argument, they would argue that the first 16th note, so the first 16th, the A sharp octave in the first bar wouldn't be part of it, part of the phrasing. You could argue either way if it's a pre-beat or if it's part of the phrasing. I think the really important thing though is to get the 16th note crisp and clear, as opposed to being some 8th note. Please don't. Yeah, bit of a difference there. That's really, really important. Yeah, and I think the important thing with this is you just have to practice it a lot. I think with the 16th note pattern, you need to be able to differentiate it between a dotted 16th with a dotted 8th, with the half notes in there, with the triplets, which there are some. The whole left hand is also triplets, weirdly. For some reason it doesn't say anywhere in the Belief score that they're triplets, but because it's in compound meter, it will be in triplets. It does indicate that on the Schirmer as well, actually. You just need to practice that. And a nice analogy, I like working with analogies, is the idea of, when you learn to drive the car with the clutch, right? At first it seems really abstract that you're doing sort of changing the gear, but at the same time pressing down the clutch, all that, but it becomes subconscious very quickly. So I think you just really need to practice that a lot, and eventually it will become subconscious, because all that is something that you can't get it wrong. I think it's the most authentic bit of the piece, and it gives the piece its almost this sort of it really gives the piece its character, put it that way. I think, as I said, if you want to treat these 16th notes, the C sharp one, the end of bar 2, and the A sharp octave, the first note you play in the right hand, in the piece, as sort of this pre-beat, this grace note, I wouldn't even know how you classify it. You can, but I think the important thing is to differentiate the phrasing as Schirmer does, and I agree with the phrasing in Schirmer. So do consult the Schirmer when looking at the phrasing to really understand what we're looking at. I think that's my advice on that. So we need to look at the left hand and the right hand and how they accompany each other. So the left hand accompaniment throughout the whole piece is essentially in triplets. There are a couple of exceptions, and there are about 4 bars on page 3, hands at the end chords. But for the great majority of the piece, they are in this triplet figure. And I think a way that really, I see it as acting as a ground bass, as sort of this, almost this sort of metronomic thing, and the right hand slots in or plays in at the same time. But the important thing is obviously to play the right hand in the correct rhythm. If you're starting to play these triplets as sort of like, I don't know, 2/8 notes and a quarter note, the whole bar and the meter is going to be wrong. And then when you have the right and the left hand interacting, then there might be some issues that come about it. So you need to try and get as regular as possible. And this is one of the biggest difficulties of this piece, is trying to get this left hand in the correct tempo and in its consistent tempo. It does need quite a lot of stamina. I think one way that I remember sort of my mentors telling me when I learned this piece at first, as I said, I was probably 16 or 17 when I learned it first, was to leave these 16th notes as late as possible, as if you've sort of forgotten about them. And a really, really easy way to think about it is right at the start. Firstly, realise that a lot of concert pianists get this wrong. The first note in the left hand is actually a 16th note, not an 8th note. It's not. Apologies for the wrong chord there. But just a small side note there. A lot of people do forget that for some reason. The point that I'm trying to get is the left and the right hand. Keep your right hand like on your leg or something. On your thigh, to be more precise, and get it in late. Don't have your right hand ready when you're playing the left hand, because then you'll instinctively maybe come in slightly too early. Maybe you won't get as crisp of a 16th note as you want. And as I said, that is probably the most important message and takeaway from this video, is to make the 16th note as crisp as possible. So we're really looking at it. notice I came in very late with my right hand. That is one technique in approaching this. Now obviously you can't apply this everywhere because most of the time the right hand is more active than in bar 1, but the point remains that is important. I think, as I said, leaving it late is a nice way of thinking about it. Now let's talk a bit about this ascending scale figure. We see this throughout the piece. We see this a lot on page 1. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times on page 1. I see it twice on page 2, no, 3 times on page 2 actually. Another 1, 2, 3 times, or 2 times on page. So in total that's about 11 times I think, which is a big amount. So it is important. Now I'd look at the fingers. I'd say work with 1, 4, 1, 5 fingers. So I'd just have a look at that, what sounds, don't, whatever you do it. You're not going to get the, if you're an advanced pianist, it's going to be a bit more difficult. I guess to call them these sort of mini finger legatos in there, but also just for swift, at speed, it's easier to do 1, 4, 1, 5 if you practice that well, as opposed to having it in octaves, which also sound more clunky, and we want to add this sort of lyrical element and sort of harmony and euphonic sound to the piece, which we'll get to a bit later on. I think one important other thing is this little rest here. I remember personally when I was 16, I sometimes forgot about it, you know. Now what you see me do is jump up. And that's the really important bit. I describe it as a trampoline, you know. Really jump up. And then, as this is a 16th note, we apply what we learned earlier about leaving it late. If you just leave it like this, it's going to be much easier, this little gap here, to ignore the small rest in between them, where you actually have a D sharp played in the left hand. We'll talk about the left hand in a minute, how we should approach that. But the point being is, if you're jumping up, it's physically impossible to miss the note. It's very difficult to play as an 8th note unless you sort of slow down the left hand as well. So this is a way to jump up. Also, to emphasize the end of the phrasing, as we talked about, we'd be at the end of the phrasing here with this A sharp, D sharp, A sharp chord right here. That's the end of the phrasing before we have this funny pre-beat grace note, call it what you like, C sharp 16. It's a bit of a weird phrase that, the first 2 notes in bar 3 in the right hand. If you could call it a phrase, I don't know what the musical definition of how many notes need to be within a phrase, but I think it's really important to understand that it adds a sort of almost cadential ending to the piece, almost a sort of feeling of home base, right? It obviously provides a bit of a resolution to the harmony, which then obviously is based off of the next bit, is based off a semitone higher than the first sort of main phrase, call it that, the A sharp, starting on the A sharp. Now I'm going to start on the B natural, which is obviously the ending of that. Also, I recommend that I'm not doing that. It's not very exemplary. Should be doing what I'm telling you to do. I'd recommend doing something like this. You could do 1, 5 as well. Obviously important to keep the 2 on this F sharp, which is obviously a half note versus the others being quarter notes. That's just an important side note there. I think also, yeah, another way of looking at this ascending scale figure, which is obviously slightly different with regards to notes. One of them starts on this sort of D sharp, A sharp, D sharp, and we start on a E natural, B, it would be B, and E natural as well, and then the other one starts on a G sharp, a D sharp, and G sharp. Yeah, so they're all starting on different notes, and just note that that they just occur slightly differently harmonically, but actually they come back as well throughout the piece in different forms and so on and so forth. But I think the point that's more important is also to spread your hands. There's another good piece of advice I got from a teacher, which is this idea of really having, and I spoke about this earlier, of having big hands. Not only the left hand with these sort of tenths and 11ths and all these extreme notes, which are obviously impossible to play. I can't play D sharp, G sharp. I think certain pianists in the past would be able to. Rachmaninoff for sure, I can do this, but I wouldn't recommend say that. I'll talk about that in a minute, about the left hand, as I said. But I think the important thing really being about just spreading your hands, keeping them wide, and really just to make sure that we're getting it right. Because if you're playing it sort of like stagnant, it's going to be quite clunky. So bigger phrasing, more spread hands, sort of more euphonic sound. It's quite advanced, but I expect that you watching this will understand that and will know how that works. So that makes sense. As I said, just make sure of, I'm just trying to figure out what I'm saying here. Yes, to play with the crescendo, that's important. The crescendos are quite important. The Belayev score for some reason is a bit weird. I don't know if it's deliberate or not, but there are some crescendos that sometimes are practically missing. So bar 4, for example, on the ascending scale, starting on an E natural, E natural, we actually don't see a crescendo going on there, which we normally see in that figure. But I'd recommend playing it throughout the piece with this figure, because the next sort of figure that has the same harmonies, i.e. starting on this E, B, E natural, B, E natural, is in bar 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, where you do have crescendo. So I don't know why, I don't know if this is an error, or if this is deliberate. If it would be deliberate, I would love to understand the theory and the principle behind that, but I would recommend the rule of thumb being that every single ascending scale figure that we've been talking about should have a crescendo attached to it. And more importantly, in my opinion, is this sort of decrescendo afterwards in the new phrase, what we talked about earlier with this sort of this new phrase, this 2-note phrase, which sort of provides the cadential feeling, the home bass feeling, the bar 3 or that in bar 5. So I think that's important to realise, sort of the decrescendo and the crescendo. So I'm just going to play this now. I'll try one-handed. Listen to the crescendo here. Yeah, apologies if I hit a couple of notes there, but I think the crescendos are really important. And also bear in mind that we're only starting the crescendo when the left and the right hands go in different rhythms, because you have a 4/3 interaction between the left and the right hand, because in the third bar, my iPad always keeps turning on, it's been annoying. The third beat of the bar, looking at bar 2 for example, they're actually both in triplet figures, so you're actually playing them together. But then if you notice later on, we break off that triplet meter, I guess you could call it, and so that's when the rhythm becomes, we have the 4/3 bit, which is quite difficult as well, but I'll talk a bit more about that when I talk about the left hand. But that's only when the crescendo comes in, so just note that, don't start it earlier. That's I think the point I'm trying to make. And the scores, the Schiema I see here doesn't start it early. The Belayev doesn't either, when it has these crescendos, a bit weird, it's missing sometimes. So I think that's the important thing. Another tip and trick you could do is sort of, before you're at the level of playing it two-handed or playing the whole, before you're playing it two-handed, you can practice with your pinky. And I need to practice that personally as well, but I think it would be really good to practice. It would be good for 2 reasons. Firstly, to really hear the melody. You want to hear the higher bit. And then also just to get the leaps right. It's quite difficult, it's quite grueling practice, very difficult actually, because obviously your pinky is your weakest finger by a bit of a distance, but that'll help you sort of hear the melody better. I think it's a really good practice, and also to help you get sort of to solidify sort of the fingers in the 1, 4, 1, 5 fingers I was talking about in the ascending scales, which I haven't practiced well enough. I do apologise. And also it will help you with the probability of hitting the correct notes. Remember I talk about how sometimes you're going to be leaping up. There's the trampoline idea, and this idea that when you land, especially at pace, you might be hitting something like that, which also a lot of concert pianists do, and that's just because of the vast pace of the piece and the difficulty, and I do that as well. It's totally normal, but the point I'm getting at is I think you'll just have more sense of direction, I guess you could call it. So practice with the pinky as well, just the upper voice in the right hand would be another piece of advice. Now let's talk about the left hand, as I talked about that, sort of hit about it a bit. I think the segregation between the left and the right hand is important. We practice both of them differently because they are completely independent of each other. Obviously it has some similarities, but most of the time you're not really playing off each other particularly much. You know, they are completely different. And as I said, the left hand for 99% of the piece is in triplets, right? With a very small couple of exceptions, which we'll talk about. As I said, I feel they sort of act as sort of this round bass, call that, or you know, sort of this metronome. And as I said, you have to play it in the correct rhythm. Practice with the metronome, you know, in triplets, getting that. As I said, I practice it at 95, I think, with the metronome, and just to really get those right. What we don't want to hear is something like, first you have to play as a 16th note, so don't do that. It's going to throw you off completely and will not. It really needs to be completely metronomical. Also an F sharp nor a B flat. I do apologise, but I think that drives home the point. It just has to be in perfect sort of rhythm. Otherwise, you're going to hit off the right hand as well. Now, one thing that frustrates me when I watch videos or listen to pianists or you know, advanced professors sort of look at this piece is this idea of these really high notes in the left hand. At the start we only have us moving up to D sharp in the first bar, but in the second bar we're already looking at in the, well, be the second beat, the middle note. We're already here, which is quite far within left hand, in right hand territory. And if we actually look at how Scriabin's written this, it's actually impossible to play this because you're supposed to be playing a half note, which lengthwise would durate for those two first triplets in bar 2, but then you're supposed to play the right hand. So just bear that in mind. It's, you know, composers do that sometimes. Prokofiev is a master of playing these sort of, it's physically impossible to play. Point being is, don't start taking these notes, as easy as it is to do so, in your right hand. I'm really going to emphasize that because I find we need to respect the phrasing, and we're not going to respect the phrasing in that. And the second thing is, it's not going to help us with maintaining this ground bass, this rhythm that we're looking at, right? That has to be stable. If we're starting to take notes in the right hand, maybe one note every bar, and it's not always the same note, the rhythm in the left hand might become a bit sort of go off. So we really need to be careful that we make sure that we stay these notes. If it's saying we should be playing in the left hand, please play in the left hand. And there are some composers. There's a video I'm going to link in the description below by John, I think it's called John Bell, who's an American pianist and a bit of a Scriabin enthusiast. And he makes the point, he says you have to take it there to make your life more easy. I can't disagree with him more due to my reasons, but as I said, that's his point. He's a better expert than me in Scriabin, but this is my personal opinion. You should not be taking these notes in the right hand. Yes, it's technically easier to play in the right hand because, as I say, it's deep in right hand territory, but please don't. So how are we going to make these leaps work? Firstly, as I said, you have to play them in individually. The birds are quite noisy today, aren't they? I do apologise. I think you need to really have a look at the fingers. How will we work with the fingers? I'm just looking at the fingers here on the go. Yeah, the same fingering as in the Schirmer, fingers as in the Schirmer, yeah. So we're looking at 1 on the A sharp, which is the big bar 1, 5, yeah, and then now the important bit here is to play this note as 2. Talking about. It's really important just to have this 2. Bear in mind, if we look at the patterns between the left and the right hand, in the left hand, you could just divide the bar into two sort of sections, right? The first section comprising of 6 notes, so 3 triplets, 2 times 3 two triplets, and if you look at that carefully, we see some sort of octave going on, or something. Become later on on this page, it becomes sort of these tenths or these ninths or these 11ths sort of arpeggiations, and then later, but it comprises of that, which really needs to be able to do these. You need to have the 2 here. It's mostly on A flat actually throughout the piece. So the 2 there is really important. Just follow the fingers here. I don't think it's possible otherwise. And just use, as I said, these notes. The note before the highest note in that particular sort of mini phrase, I guess you could call it, would be, so in bar 1 we're looking at the bouncing from F sharp to D sharp. It's not a particularly big jump, but definitely bar 2 in the second triplet we're going from F sharp to A sharp. Just use that to bounce off 2, 1, and then back to 2. That's how it works, and really you need to practice that individually. It's one of the most grueling tasks of this piece, is just to practice this individually. Also, another thing, don't try and play these chords. Play the octaves as octaves, but not anything any interval bigger than that. Play that as arpeggiated. As I said earlier, I mentioned F sharp. I'm not going to do that. Why I'm not going to do that? For a couple of reasons. Firstly, I like the added dramaticism of an arpeggiation. It doesn't obviously say in the score. But I think the other point is that if you're stuck on this chord, at the speed that you're supposed to be playing the left hand, it's going to be very difficult to change this to that. And if you do that, it will have this very static, sort of dissonant feel, which you don't want. So really, just to really hit home that, don't play them arpeggiated if they're not octaves. That would be my advice on that. And will just also help you with your dexterity and sort of the movement of your fingers, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, phrasing. This is another sort of bit of subject to debate. I mean, I just see here the Belayev doesn't have any pedal. I don't think throughout the whole piece. I don't see any to be at least. But the Schirmer has pedals every 2 bars. Apologies there, I was shooting my camera. We were talking about the phrasing in the left hand and the pedals. So as I said, the Schirmer, for some reason, does pedaling every 2 bars. In my opinion, you do pedaling every bar. Now, I understand why they do pedaling every 2 bars, and that is because of the phrasing. Because as I said, we look at the phrasing earlier, and it's a bit different. Obviously, the pedaling varies a bit, which we'll talk about in a minute. I personally like to change the pedal every bar. I don't think it makes a major disruption, because I feel that the transition between bar 1 and bar 2 is important, but on the other hand, I just think you don't want to make it too mushy. That's just my personal opinion. I think you can play and experiment with that towards the end of the piece, which pedaling you prefer. But I do think, yeah, it's important to look at that. Another thing that I'd just like to talk about before we move on to some more nuances of the first A part is to really hit home that you shouldn't be starting the piece too loud. I think if you imagine the whole 8-bar phrase, the whole first 8-bar phrase, we're really seeing the loudest point being on this forte in bar 2, 4, 7, in 7. So you have this forte on this F sharp, B natural, F sharp chord. Yeah, hands on the 4th. And that's a loud bit. So if you imagine there being this sort of invisible large crescendo starting from the first beat all the way up to this I guess the loudest point of the first 8-bar phrase, that being bar 7. Now, why am I saying this? People start too loud. People will start like, and they start too quickly as well, and then that sort of thing happens. No, start quite quietly. Now, interestingly, the Schirmer has put down mezzo forte. I don't know if you put mezzo forte or mezzo piano. I don't know. But I see something in between that, in my opinion. I just think mezzo forte is slightly too loud. I think the temptation comes pretty quickly to start that. I've written here in my notes the mezzo forte in the right hand as of the first A sharp 16th there, sort of just before the fourth beat of the bar, the first bar. That's one way of potentially looking at it. And definitely the left hand needs to be slightly quieter, slightly more restrained. The left hand cannot be dominating the right hand. We all know that, because the right hand's the more important, the authentic, the exciting part and material in this particular section of the piece, well actually in the whole piece, to be quite frank. So I think just don't start too loud, and yeah, I think, yeah, moving on, if we're looking at the first 8 bars, we haven't talked about the last 2 bars of the first 8 bars, so of the first main phrase. This sort of descending passage thing, which actually comes back a few times in this piece, and is quite important to talk about. I think the first thing important is to look at the melodies within this bit. You obviously have the main melody. I'm just going to play the main melody in octave. And then you have all these sort of notes in between, which I would probably label as a secondary melody. And I think it's really important to bring these out, you know, and some of them are a bit sort of redundant. So just have a look at exactly how they work. But more importantly, I think, just have a look at where exactly they come in. But really just try and sort of hear them. It goes back to the pieces I was recommending earlier. That Chopin Étude number was Opus 25, number 10. So it'd be number 22 if you're looking at the whole Opus 10, Opus 25 sets together. And yeah, I mean, just look at those and just make sure that you can really hear those. They're quite nice. In my opinion, there are some interpretational differences. Horowitz, for example, will really slow down. So if he, I'm just going to try and play this. And then there are people like Scriabin. Now, obviously, when you listen to composers play their own pieces, there's a lot of context that goes behind it. Is it to show it off to the audience like Liszt would have done and deliberately plays a bit quicker? Is it, I don't know, for some reason they didn't want to perform, I don't know. A lot of context behind it. Personally, I obviously love listening. When you have the opportunity to listen to composers playing their own pieces, it's a marvellous thing. But I mean, I think we look at these pieces now 150 years later, in this piece about 115 years later, from a more revisionist point of view. And I would say that more pianists really sort of slow down in these 2 bars, and I do personally as well, as does people like Horowitz, just to really hear this lush melody coming out, not only through the main melody but also through this secondary voicing, this secondary melody that I was talking about, and through the nice left hand, which sort of diverts a bit from what we've seen before. Look at, also bear in mind the interactions. The left hand is, as always in triplets, but the right hand sort of moves between half, quarter, 8th notes, and there's a triplet in there as well. So just mind those as well. And then also, I'd really recommend looking at the Schiema scoring, which has, once again, this idea that you have this two-beat phrase, these 2 notes that form this phrase in at the end of bar. Well, this would be the start of bar 9, which is, in my opinion, well, probably would be the first 2, 4, 6. Yeah, I mean, it's the bar that connects the start of the end of the A part of this A section. So the first 8-bar phrase with the second 8-bar phrase, and they once again sort of say that this F, A, C double sharp, F sharp, sorry, F sharp, A sharp, C double sharp, F sharp, and that's really, but that's its own phrase. So do look at that as well, which I think is quite nice. They don't put any, yeah, they do put a bit of pedal in there as well, the Schiema scoring. So yeah, just look out for that. Look out for that as well. I think it's quite important. Yeah, what else do I have here? Yeah, another way would be to practice this, to not speed up, would be to play them arpeggiated. Now, do not play this ever arpeggiated performance-wise, but it will force you, you'll have to slow down because you're constrained by playing them arpeggiated. What I mean is, starting at bar 7, last two notes you could probably play non-arpeggiated, definitely. Sort of bar 8 where you have this. Which would naturally form to. That's bar 8 is really one where you want to start slowing down. It also says here poco diminuendo, which most pianists will then instinctively also slow it down, which doesn't say in the mid-IF score. It does say in the Schiema score, so this is why I use 2 scores. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an important thing. Yeah, let's talk about the differences between the first and the second phrase in the A part. The volume, look carefully, if you see carefully in bar 10, which is a penultimate bar in the last system of the Schiema score, according to my iPad, we start the phrase, which is an 8-bar phrase, in forte, as opposed to the start of the first 8-bar phrase at the start of the piece, which I, as I said, would start at probably mezzo forte in the right hand, maybe slightly quieter, right? So I think that's important just to say that. That's just sort of with regards to the volume of the piece. And then look at the left hand in the second 8-bar phrase. There are some differences. Right, so apologies, I was cut off by the camera running out of battery, hence different clothing, hence a different day. Now, we got cut off at the time where I was going to compare the first 8-bar phrase in this A section, the first page of the Bidwell score, to the second 8-bar phrase, right? We talked about phrasing already, and the right hand is almost identical. There's a small difference, but we'll talk about that at the end. That is in bar 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, there's a slight difference with regard to harmonies. That's just a transition to the B section, which we'll talk about next after this. What was interesting that I found out, and I only noticed this once whilst preparing for this video, is that the left hand, actually, the differences in the left hand complement the right hand melody. And I don't know if this is deliberate. I would assume it's of some sort of harmonic reason. If we compare, for example, bar 2 to bar 9, we obviously see that the octaves are a bit different in the left hand. I think that's the first bit to realise, is that the left hand is mostly going to be in octaves. We don't have these sort of arpeggiated intervals. This one here, for example, the start bar 2, this one here, which we're talking about, not to play them arpeggiated, obviously, this rather big interval. Compare that to the octaves, which are becoming all the more predominant in the second 8-bar phrase. We compare bar 2 to bar 9, we see that we're moving from an A sharp, which we also have at the end of bar 1, but that's now suddenly an octave, into, instead of this sort of weird 10th interval, we actually just have this really deep octave, which also complements the dynamics, right? Because we're talking now about a louder volume. We start the second 8-bar phrase on forte compared to the start of that, where we sort of argue that would be between mezzo forte and slightly lower if in doubt. So that's the first thing, is really the volume. Secondly, you just need to compare. There are some octaves. You just see the end of bar 9. We also see the same thing. We just see some octaves, right? Compared to just the one D sharp there. That's one bit. Now, we're also talking about the complementing. You see that in bar 10. So you compare bar 3, I think. Yeah, you compare bar 3 to bar 10. So if we look at the harmonies in bar 10, and we compare the right hand in bar 10 to the right hand in bar 3, we see the identical harmonies going on, right? We have this lovely C sharp with an F in the middle, an F sharp in the middle, and we move down, and then we start on that, and so forth. So we see the same thing going on, but if you actually look carefully in bar 10, in the left hand, we have a slightly different left hand. First of all, we start on a deeper octave. Instead of this high octave, we start on a deeper octave, but if we look carefully, see that? We now have an F sharp. Now, where does this F sharp come in? It actually complements I call it the secondary melody in the left hand. Obviously, the main melody would be in the octave, and we have this lovely, right? We're holding the F sharp because it's a half note. And that complement is complemented by this, because in bar 3, we look carefully, it's just an F sharp. So we have this additional harmony here, which would add to that. And we see similar examples. We go on to bar, that would be bar 12, I think, wouldn't it? 9, 10, 11, 12. Yes, 12. And we compare that to bar 5. we see this C double sharp creep in, which we see the chord that we land on as well. And later on, 2 beats later, we also see the similar chord. It's actually B and a G sharp as opposed to a, so I just lost where I was, just G sharp. So you see how they complement each other, and that's quite an interesting observation there that you may not have known. And then we look at, you could argue, and then we notice the main difference I was talking about, which is bar 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, where we have... Sorry, but we notice there we're actually changing harmonies slightly. Compare that to bar 7, not 7, 8, and we see slightly we have this A sharp harmony coming in here. With this E sharp as well built in, which is obviously different to what we had earlier, which was an A sharp, D sharp, E sharp. Yeah, notice that slight difference. That will help with the transition of the harmony, and instead of having a descending left hand in the octaves, which you've seen so much on this, E sharp, which you've seen so much in this page, we actually now have suddenly to go up to C sharp, which would hint at the B section. Also note the additional accompaniment here in bar 13. We're having a B and an F, E sharp, sorry, and a B and an E natural, which I think beforehand was just an E sharp and an E natural, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. So just notice these slight differences. Don't learn the first phrase twice because they are different, but you'll get used to it. You'll get used to it. It takes a bit of practice. It is a bit difficult. I remember my first performances of this piece. Probably got it wrong a couple of times. I got muddled up. That is totally natural. So that's sort of the first page in a nutshell of the piece. It's the most difficult and the bit I'm going to talk about most, because the rest of it is sort of page 2 is a bit of a spin-off of that, and page 3, or repeat the second A section, is very similar. So we don't need to spend that much more time looking at the other 2 sections, but obviously we will. Page 2. This is what I call the lyrical section. I'll give you a little excerpt as I'm saying. I am sight reading. I'm going to go right from here. Slightly too loud, especially here in bar 5 of page 2, we start on piano, which I just didn't. But I mean, I think, for me personally, I think this is the most euphonic sounding bit. I call it the lyrical section for a reason, and it seems to be a bit rushed, in my opinion, by a lot of pianists. You know, you really hear them do. I really think we should be listening, hearing that melody. I think it's really important to get those, and also what you should be remembering, and this is, as I said, more advanced, but also I should be playing this when I'm playing this, which I'm not really doing, are these falsettos. I'm just looking in the Schirmer score if they're there. Interestingly, in the Schirmer score, we see them either denoted as crescendos and decrescendos, with their gap being with the note, the high note, which in this case would be the G sharp in bar 1. Also note that's with this 16th note pattern being in between it. I prefer the denotion of sforzandos and the way that the Belafiev score emphasised it with the crescendo, which we talked about before, with this ascending scale pattern, which is obviously familiar from the first page. So really be trying to emphasize those. If I hit the right note, I'll make it sound a bit better. And so on and so forth. Dun 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 dun. Surprise, there's no sforzando there, in my opinion. Actually, is there one in the? There isn't. Interesting. We're going to cut this bit out. Yeah, so I mean, try and really emphasize it. Try again. And so on and so forth. Da 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 da. Mind the lovely crescendo. So really get that working. With regards to fingers, potentially look at some 4/5 fingers. I sort of sometimes do it, sometimes don't. The Bidwell has no info on that, but I'm sure you can figure that out, whatever suits your hands the best. I think probably more advanced pianists should be looking at some sort of 4/5, potentially bringing the 3 rare occasions, so 1/3, 1/4, 1/5 fingers, just to make it sound a bit more swift, a bit more gliding, a bit more legato in there. I think the phrasing ideas by Free Time are an interesting observation. So have a look at those. They have this, they obviously are still based off this basic idea which you've talked about of this sort of small subordinate phrase following the longer ba-bum, ba-bum, bum phrase, which is slightly longer in this section. So do have a look at that as well. Yeah, I mean, you can add a bit of rubato. As I said, make it lyrical. We really, once again, want to hear the right hand. Blah, blah, blah. It's a very singable melody. There's an interesting rendition that I'd really like you to listen to. Is by Alexei Sultanov, who I think was a Russian pianist who died very young, very tragic, really talented. And there's a performance of him playing it live, and I think it's one of the best performances of the whole piece in general out there. But you really hear how he brings out the counter melody in the left hand. Ba-dum, ba-dum. It's really sort of a very unique touch. Might be something to look out for really advanced pianists. That's just me. I haven't done that in the past, but I will try and experiment with that in the future. Once again, we have balanced 8-bar phrasing. I think I hinted at it when I played you this little section here. This sort of this D minor section we move into in bar 2, 4, 6. Well, obviously bar 9. Marks which doesn't really have that many fragments of the original theme in it. But that's the second 8-bar phrase, which is sort of almost like a new section in itself, and sort of combines elements of the early material and then builds up to the repetition or the recapitulation, if you could call it that, which is the starting of the second A section in the penultimate bar in the last system of page 2. We'll talk about that in a moment. There are some other ideas that you could talk about, minor sforzandos, especially on the second page in the second 8-bar phrasing, and really get to move it up, you know. Just trying to look at, I've lost a bit of lost the count where exactly I am. Yeah, I mean, in the second 8-bar phrase, really look at some secondary voicing work. We've talked a little bit about that before. Look at the secondary voicing. Just have a look at those. I mean, there are some weird, as I just played it, almost sounded wrong, but in itself that forms a secondary melody. So really look at trying to get this voicing out. As we go through these different key areas, which, by the way, note how they're related by each other. They move down by a semitone. If you look at it carefully, down to the main melodic material, what these sort of these quarter note triplets are sort of hanging about. I mean, yeah, you can add quite a lot of humour. You can make it quite unique. Sort of tug at these sforzandos, really work on it. Mind where they are because they're not always obvious. accentuated, but really tug on those. Dum, 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 make it unexpected. It's a bit more obvious than the sforzandos in the first part of this section, because obviously they're sort of based off of the main material we had presented to us from the start of the piece. These are a bit less obvious with these octaves moving down. We haven't had these sforzandos with octaves yet. So really work on those. Be quite an interesting touch. Also, look at the relation. Obviously, when we look at, let's say, what is that? 2, 4, 6, 8, 4, 6, 8. So bar 10, for example, we see this. Look at the relation there. There's obviously also a diminuendo going on. I'm assuming the schema will have similar sort of phrasing going on as it normally does. Let me have a look. Yeah, exactly. It does have this phrasing. Dum, da, dum, dum. But also you have some rests within the right hand, which obviously don't make it the authentic 16th note motif, but it's a spin off it. It's really cool to see that. Yeah, so one of the loudest bits of this second page, let alone the whole piece, is this B major chord. B major chord in the 5th system, the first bar, which would be bar 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, bar 12. And so on and so forth. Dum, 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 bum. You have this E sharp chord, and then you move in to the transition into the A part, the second A part. And what we really see is this big crescendo looming over this ascending part. We obviously start on this fortissimo, which both the Schirm and the Belayev denote. But they don't know is this sort of natural D crescendo. I think most pianists see this triplet figure in the right hand. The dum, what is it? Yeah, dum dum, going down. No, I'm playing that wrong. Restart. So one of the loudest bits in this section is this fortissimo in the 5th system. It's bar 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13. We obviously have to refine that slightly, my playing. But we restart on this fortissimo on this B major chord. Bum, 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 bum. And lots of, obviously the fortissimo is something there. But what the scores don't denote, and I don't blame them, is these crescendos within the triplets that follow. Firstly, we have this natural D crescendo there. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, bum. I see it as sort of in a tug. Bum, 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 bum. So you start with that. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 bum. Bum, 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 and so on and so forth. So we start on fortissimo. The second chord I really go from mezzo piano up to mezzo forte, so dum ba ba bum. And the next one I go from mezzo piano to forte, and then go mezzo piano to fortissimo, if not mezzo forte to fortissimo in that third bar of this section. And so yeah, I mean it's emphasised by these accents. Which obviously now have these ornamental sort of chord, this additional sort of denser chords within, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And play that. The E sharp plays quite an important role, just as a transition. Bam bum bum bum. That sort of reminds you of the harmonics, harmony. That returns, that we obviously know from page 1, and that marks the start of the ending, the second A part. I really think you should be, just try and really practice that, and I really think learning the main melody and then building around that is important. So to really look at to what extent is it based off the first page, off the main melody. The start is. Just note there, for example, I made that error as well. It's because obviously then you have some added harmony coming in there with these F sharps. So really look at that, practice that, and then work at how exactly you bring these inner chords. You could do it with a bit of flapping, bum bum. You could practice the inner chords, for example. So there. I think you get the idea that we leave out the inner chords and practice flapping them. Then, for example, what would be really advanced practice is to only play the middle chords and really get that right. You'd also hear where the left hand places compared to the right hand, which is obviously slightly different at times when you have these 16th notes coming in. So really focus on that, really get the clarity of the melody. I think that's really important. And then look at the parallels on page 3 to page 1. It might not always be particularly obvious, but look at the descending bit in the second system. We go along bum 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 bum, and then we just have the extension of that, the dum. And we have that different section, which we'll talk about a little bit there. So really look at that and just sort of work up. You could once again see these 4 bars here in the last page, this sort of build up, as really play that as a build up. You know, you have an increased crescendo, da dum bum ba bum bum. Listen to Horowitz's rendition of that's quite interesting. Once again, also with regards to the first 2 bars in the second system, really look at that natural decrescendo, which we talked about before, the slowing down, which some pianists do. Scriabin himself doesn't, but Horowitz, for example, does it beautifully. I do it as well. So yeah, just look at that. Then we have these 4 bars which are a bit weird. Where do they fit in? Well, they're sort of loosely related, you know, with this sort of these semitonal movements up and down. Harmonies are somewhat similar. But the left hand, for some reason, goes out of the triplet mode, which we've seen it throughout the whole piece, and goes into quarter notes. And goes into a weird quarter note patterns, which harmonically doesn't make much sense, to be quite frank. You could do quite a big analysis, and you do see some parallels with regard to sort of semitonal shifts and so on and so forth. But on the whole, you don't see that much. But the really weird thing that catches you out is that the right hand is suddenly in triplets with half notes and quarter notes over the top, which are the melody, and the left hand is suddenly in this syncopated quarter note. So we obviously have 3-2, 3-2, 4 times in each bar. The way that I remember this is I found this the most grueling 4 bars of the whole piece, and I think there's sort of consensus amongst most pianists that that's the case. Why? Because it sort of throws you off. It's a bit weird, but also obviously because you have this weird 3-2 syncopation going on. The way that I learned it, I have a funny little story where I remember not nailing it. I somehow did maybe like 4-2, which is a natural instinct, where you have an additional F sharp B in the left hand, for example, in the right hand. Sorry. So you'd be doing something like let me try and recreate this. I'm playing it correctly. I think you get the idea that I'm having that I would have 4 notes in the left and right hand, which obviously completely wouldn't make sense rhythmically. But that's what I did, and I remember never nailing it, or I somehow made it sort of dotted or something weird. Now the way to remember it is actually to see it as making the right hand subconscious. What do I mean by that? Well, the right hand is essentially in the same meter as before, right? It's in this triplet weird meter with some stuff going over the top. We see that in the bar beforehand, sort of. Look at maybe the 3rd beat of that bar, right? We see something going on. We see similarities there. Obviously, we don't have these half notes always going across. We do sometimes. The half notes actually often beat themselves. That makes sense within the compound meter. Now, what I'm trying to say is use that and think and work with your imagination, and this is how I often work, to imagine that you're playing exactly the same as earlier, just with some different notes and with these sort of melodies over the top. And so on and so forth, yeah. Make sure you play the right quarters and make sure you play them all correctly there. But that's the same as what we've seen beforehand, right? And then notice the left hand is completely different. So then what you do is you practice that a lot, and then you just bring the left hand. left hand would be. Okay. And then you just bring in the left hand, so you just say. Try and practice it that way, that you have a conscious left hand versus a subconscious right hand. That makes sense. Young labels it as sort of you backing off and then swell and then you re-attack. Bum 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 and so on and so forth. That would be another way of interpreting it. I just see it as a bit of a machine with a left da 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 da. It's just sort of like the final hurrah before you see the end of this piece. So do practice that. I feel that was really helpful. Also, when you're imagining it, just really turn your head and just practice the left hand on yourself. So that's how I look at it. That's probably the speed you want to do it. Also make sure in this 4 bars that actually the left hand should probably be at the same volume, if not louder than the right hand, which is, it's like doing the inverse of everything you've learned beforehand. I didn't completely do it like that. I should practice that more. It's difficult to do if you're used to playing all of the whole piece in that left hand being slightly quieter than the right hand. In this case, it's the other way around because the left hand's obviously unique. Yeah, I think that's the final bits. The final was at 6-7 bars, just more of the same, you know. See the rhythm when it returns in the second bar in the penultimate system. You know, da-dum, ba-dum, bum. You're still the same with octaves, da-dum, dum. And you have this sort of, and it gets really loud, this ascending bit here. And yeah, then we have this, the first beat of the penultimate bar, bum, bum, ba-bum, bum. What would that be? It would be. So then you have this bit in the second bar. Obviously there's only a certain volume you can play that bit, but try and keep it as sort of as loud as you can. Maybe drop off the pedal. I don't know what the Shima says with pedal. Belayev doesn't have any pedal. Yeah, it doesn't even have any pedal. No Shima, you go off it. Yeah. Hashima interestingly says you arpeggiate the first note because obviously the chord is impossible to play on one hand. I personally like to have yeah, just sort of to see that. That's my way that you do it. You have a D crescendo there. They say non-arpeggi, which I've never seen as a denotion before, but I think the point is quite clear. They play arpeggiated, some pianists play arpeggiated, others play like me. Way that you can debate it either way, but I think the important thing is obviously that rest in between the high notes. The high notes. Yeah, that right. Bum bum. So that was the masterclass on that. I mean, I've written down the Spark notes on the Google Doc. You can check that out. I hope that was helpful. I do sometimes speak a bit quickly. And sometimes it's more clear in my head than to what I actually say. That's why I recommend you follow the score when you watch the video. I hope it helped. Just a couple of things. As you can see, my pages aren't finished yet. One of the recordings we're listening to, I've hinted a few. There's Scriabin himself, which you talked about before. He's very quick, obviously. Once again, we have to look at the context. Where was Scriabin himself? Was he in front of some sort of mistress that he might have trying to attract and deliberately playing it fast? You see sort of, you know, the sort of Lisztian elements of bravura. But he plays it quicker. Obviously, most composers play their pieces much quicker than us. Maybe you call them revisionists today. Play them. It's up to you. Matsuev is someone that really plays it as fast as he has. He's gotten a lot of criticism for that. But people have began to recognise that it was actually based on Scriabin's rendition, as far as I know. I personally find it too quick to pay this piece in 150, but people do. Horowitz is a really interesting rendition. Remember we talked about the slowing of tempo in bar 2, 4, 6, 8. That's unique, which is a complete contrast to Scriabin, who sped up. Obviously, as we said, the Schirmer also has it denoted. If my full score is working, yeah, here we are, with a poco diminuendo. You can argue both. Alexei Sultanov, I hinted at him earlier with his counter melodies on the start of page 2 on the B-bit. Quite a compelling performance, very good, especially for the fact that it was live. Slightly too fast in my opinion, but the counter melodies I was talking about, there's some really unique touches in there worth listening to. Apparently there's also a Rachmaninoff recording out there, but I actually doubt that it is a Rachmaninoff recording. It's also on YouTube and they claim it was Rachmaninoff who played it. I'm pretty sure it isn't, you know, it's very clunky, very lot of wrong chords and really struggling through the piece. And really also struggling with these bigger intervals, these arpeggiated intervals that we've been talking about, which is obviously completely unlike Rachmaninoff because those are especially easy for him with the size of his hands. So I don't think it's Rachmaninoff, I'm just putting that out there. There are also a couple of unseen ones. Obviously the Sultanov's a bit of a rare one. The other one I found really rare but really good was by a pianist called Morton Estrin, who I think was Billy Joel's teacher. And is the son of Robert Estrin, no, the father of Robert Estrin, who does quite a lot of piano videos on YouTube. It's a very lyrical interpretation, really quite enjoyable, quite worth listening to. Another one is the Uruguayan pianist Dinora Varsi, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Also another very lyrical interpretation, a really different timbre to the piece as well. Really worth listening to. I mean, as I said, with regard to resources, that's all I have. There aren't many resources out here. It's one of the reasons why I'm doing this particular pieces. There's a couple of academic papers out there which are worth a read if you enjoy this sort of stuff with regards to textual layering. They look at the body of work by the composer rather than just this piece, but they touch on it a couple of times. There's also a link with many listening examples, so this emphasizing what I was saying earlier about exposing yourself to lots of different renditions of this piece because they are so different. There's also a masterclass we've been talking about by John Bell Young, who is an American Scriabin expert, and he talks a lot about the interpretational stuff. There's some really insightful advice. He does say you should be taking these high notes in the left hand on the first page and in the right hand, which I fundamentally disagree with. But there's some other stuff which I think I've also talked about on and off and quoted him throughout this video. So yeah, I've put the links in that Google Doc I've been talking about, which is in the descriptor below. I hope this first masterclass ever was insightful. It's taken me 2 days to do this because I've had to record this twice now due to the fact that halfway through the camera ran out of battery and the other camera is broken and the camera shop's closed. But other than that, I hope it was enjoyable. I hope I didn't I made clear my points, and as I said, if you have any questions, any requests, please do let me know. The new masterclass is going to come quite soon. It's going to be a Chopin Étude. I won't reveal which one, but it'll be a Chopin Étude. So that will be the third masterclass, technically the second proper one, because the first masterclass was that introductory video. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this is insightful. And as I said, yeah, follow me on whatever social media you want on YouTube. Really would really help me grow this channel and spread the word for these OMCs. And I hope these are helpful. So have a great day, and I hope this has provided you with some more insights, some more fruitful thoughts, some more help if you need it on this really fascinating, sort of fascinating to analyse and great piece of work. There's so much to it and so much to analyse within mere 3 pages. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. Goodbye.